At 3 a.m., the Strait of Hormuz belongs to the radar. There is no visual reference, no horizon, no shapes on the water. The running lights of commercial traffic in the eastbound lane are present as points of light that the eye cannot confidently assign to a specific vessel type or heading. A white light at 2 miles could be a supertanker's mast headlight or a small vessel's stern. And in the darkness, the eye cannot resolve the question without distance data that only instruments provide. At 3 a.m. in the westbound lane, the crew on a warship's bridge wing is functionally blind beyond 200 yards. The world at 3 a.m. in the Strait of Hormuz exists in two forms: what the radar says and what it does not. The IRGCN had spent considerable institutional effort understanding the gap between those two forms. The Strait's western approach narrows progressively from the open Gulf toward the Omani coast. The navigable channel, the portion of the strait deep enough for loaded supertankers and wide enough for two-way traffic in established separation scheme lanes, is not the entire width of the strait. It is a corridor within the strait, bounded on the north by Iranian territorial waters and on the south by shoal areas, submerged features, and the Omani coastal zone. At the strait's narrowest navigable point, approximately 28 nautical miles from the Gulf of Oman exit, the westbound commercial lane is approximately 2.1 nautical miles wide from its northern boundary to its southern boundary. 2.1 nautical miles of navigable water in a westbound lane carrying supertankers at 250,000 deadweight tons. At 3 a.m., 7 vessels distributed across that 2.1 nautical mile width at irregular intervals, all without navigation lights, all without AIS transponders, all moving at 0.5 to 1.5 knots in directions that were not consistently westbound. Drifting loosely the way boats drift when their engines are at idle and the current is their primary motive force, created a geometry in that 2.1 nautical mile corridor that was not an obstruction in the legal sense. An obstruction was a fixed impediment to navigation. What the IRGCN had placed across the westbound lane at 3:07 a.m. was a field of drifting variables. 7 vessels at unknown positions that updated continuously as the current moved them, without lights that would allow optical tracking, without AIS that would allow automated tracking, visible only to radar with sufficient resolution to separate their small returns from the background clutter of a 3:00 a.m. Gulf surface with a moderate northeast swell. Each of the 7 vessels was a Dow-type craft of 12 to 18 meters, small enough that its radar cross-section in moderate sea clutter was genuinely ambiguous at ranges beyond 1 nautical mile in the degraded night conditions. Not invisible, ambiguous. The difference between those two words was the operational content of the challenge. Above all of it, at 1,800 feet altitude, a Mohajer-class surveillance drone was orbiting in a slow, wide circle, its optical and infrared cameras pointing down at the westbound lane, its communications link transmitting footage in real time to whoever was monitoring this encounter from the Iranian coast. The drone was not there to observe the IRGCN vessels. It was there to observe the U.S. ship. At 3:11 a.m., the guided missile destroyer was in the western Hormuz approach on its assigned westbound transit heading of 265 degrees, making 15 knots. Its CIC running standard night transit protocols. The surface search radar had been painting the approach since 2:45 a.m. At 2:45 a.m., the approach had been clean, commercial traffic in the expected distribution, no anomalous contacts in the westbound lane ahead. The ambient clutter of the strait's moderate northeast swell, producing the predictable pattern of noise that experienced operators filtered automatically. At 3:07 a.m., 7 contacts appeared in the approach sector ahead, not simultaneously, sequentially, as the radar's sweep resolved each small return from the background clutter on successive rotations. First one at bearing 250, range 3.8 nautical miles. Then 2 more at bearings 265 and 271, ranges 4.1 and 3.6 miles. Then a fourth at bearing 258, range 4.4 miles. The contacts appeared over a 90-second window as the radar's successive sweeps accumulated enough returns to confirm their presence against the clutter threshold. By 3:09 a.m., the CIC had 7 contacts in the approach sector. All 7 were small, radar cross-section, consistent with vessels of 12 to 25 meters. All 7 were showing minimal speed. The tracking algorithm was having difficulty assigning confident course and speed vectors to contacts moving at less than 2 knots in 1-foot swell clutter. None of the 7 had AIS. None had navigation lights visible on the bridge's optical systems. The bridge team had been looking since the first contact appeared, and the forward sector at 3:09 a.m. showed no lights at any bearing, consistent with the radar contacts. 7 dark, slow, small contacts distributed across the westbound lane at ranges between 3.4 and 4.8 nautical miles ahead. The officer of the deck acknowledged and immediately issued the call that the CIC report required. ___1___. The reduction from 15 to 10 knots bought the transit approximately 8 additional minutes before reaching the nearest contact at 3.4 nautical miles. 8 minutes to develop the picture further before the geometry required active decisions. The captain was on the bridge at 3:12 a.m. He received the picture in brief from the tactical officer. 7 dark, slow contacts distributed across the westbound lane. No lights, no AIS, no confident course data. The Mohajer drone at 1,800 feet overhead, confirmed by the EW system's radar detection at 3:10 a.m. The drone's presence was the piece that completed the picture's interpretation. 7 contacts with no navigation lights, no AIS, and a planned surveillance drone overhead at 1,800 feet was not an accidental distribution of vessels that happened to be operating without required safety equipment in the westbound approach at 3:07 a.m. It was a placement, deliberate, coordinated, designed to create a specific navigational environment in the lane that the destroyer was transiting. The navigational environment was this: 7 contacts of uncertain position, uncertain course, and uncertain composition, distributed across 2.1 nautical miles of navigable water in total darkness, whose drifting movement meant their positions were continuously changing. Passing through the field required knowing where each vessel was, not at the time of last radar acquisition, but at the time of passage, which was 25 to 35 minutes in the future for the nearest contacts. A vessel drifting at 1 knot and a 0.5 knot current, moved approximately 500 yards in 25 minutes from its last known position. 500 yards of position uncertainty for each of 7 contacts in a 2.1 nautical mile lane was a navigational problem with real operational consequences. The Mohajer overhead was recording every decision the destroyer made, every course change, every speed change, every deviation from the westbound heading, all of it on the drone's camera at 1,800 feet, all of it in real time, all of it available for whatever editorial purpose the IRGCN's media operation intended. The CPA to the nearest contact at 10 knots was now approximately 18 minutes. The captain's assessment of the situation had a specific structure. The 7 contacts were probably IRGCN vessels. The coordination of their positioning with the Mohajer's orbit and the absence of lights and AIS was too deliberate for any other explanation. They were probably not intending to collide with a U.S. warship that crossed a threshold the IRGCN had consistently avoided. They were positioned to force a choice: transit through a field of dark contacts whose positions were uncertain and whose nature was unconfirmed, which required either accepting the navigational risk or developing a tool to reduce the uncertainty before transit, or alter course to avoid the field entirely, which meant either going north into Iranian territorial waters or going south into the shoal boundary that limited the westbound lane. Altering course to avoid the field was the footage the Mohajer was there to capture. A U.S. warship visibly deviating from its westbound course at 3 a.m. because 7 dark contacts had been placed in its lane was footage the IRGCN would characterize as Iranian maritime superiority compelling American avoidance. The characterization was false. The footage would show a course change. The Mohajer would not explain why. The captain did not intend to provide course deviation footage to the drone at 1,800 feet. The first friction arrived at 3:14 a.m. from the night itself. At 3:14 a.m., the northeast swell's period synchronized with the destroyer's roll period, a transient resonance that produced 3 consecutive rolls of approximately 5 degrees to port and starboard as the ship's natural roll period matched the wave interval. At 5-degree rolls, the surface search radar's antenna was tilting to the same 5-degree angle, changing the look-down angle on nearby contacts and introducing a brief period of increased sea clutter returns as the radar painted more water surface on the rolling side than its designed geometry anticipated. During the 90-second resonance period, 2 of the 7 contacts in the approach sector temporarily merged with the background clutter and lost their confirmed status on the display. The contacts reacquired as the resonance damped, but for 90 seconds, the CIC's picture of the approach field had 5 contacts rather than 7, and the positions of the 2 that had temporarily dropped were not current when they reacquired. 2 contacts reacquired at positions 80 to 140 yards from their pre-resonance positions, within the expected drift range for vessels at 1 knot over 90 seconds, but positions that were not confirmed by continuous track. The CIC flagged the reacquired positions as uncertain. 2 contacts in the field. Positions uncertain. 5 with recent track data. Quote 2, quote, the captain said. Quote 3, quote, the drift envelope calculation took 3 minutes. 7 contacts each with a position and a maximum drift radius based on the current's direction and speed, the vessel's speed over ground estimate, and the elapsed time since last confirmed position. The drift envelopes for the two uncertain contacts were the largest, roughly 150-yard radius circles of possible position around their last known points. The combined field, with all drift envelopes plotted, showed a pattern of possible positions that covered an irregular band across the 2.1-mile approach lane. The safe passage geometry, the route through the field that minimized the probability of approaching within 500 yards of any contact's possible position, was computable. It was not wide, it was not comfortable, but it existed. The Seahawk launched at 3:18 a.m., not for the contacts directly, for the Mohajer. The helicopter climbed to 1,400 feet, 400 feet below the drone's orbit altitude, and established a track that positioned it directly below the Mohajer on successive passes of the drone's orbit. At 1,400 feet altitude, in total darkness, the Seahawk was invisible to the drone's optical camera. The drone's imaging looking downward toward the surface, not upward toward an aircraft below its orbit altitude, but the Seahawk's own radar looking upward at the drone's radar cross-section had a clear picture of the Mohajer's orbit pattern. The Seahawk's second function was the one the captain actually needed. Airborne surface search at 1,400 feet altitude. Its radar looking down at the 7 contacts from an angle that gave it fundamentally better resolution on small contacts at low speed and sea clutter than the ship's surface-mounted radar could achieve. At 1,400 feet and 3.2 nautical miles from the approach field, the Seahawk's look-down radar produced its first confident position update on all 7 contacts at 3:24 a.m. Seahawk contact report. 7 contacts confirmed. All 7. Positions updated. Contacts Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. Tracking westbound at 0.8 knots. Consistent with current drift. Contacts Delta, Echo, your uncertainties. Delta at position. Coordinates. Bearing 253. Range 3.1 miles from ship. Echo at position. Coordinates. Bearing 261. Range 2.8 miles. Foxtrot and Golf holding positions near the southern lane boundary. 7 confirmed positions. Delta and Echo resolved from their uncertain status. The drift envelope had collapsed from a 150-yard radius circle to a confirmed position. The safe passage geometry, which had been computed on envelope assumptions, was now computable on confirmed positions. And the passage route that the drift envelope calculation had identified as the least risk route was confirmed by the Seahawk's data as a valid clear corridor. The corridor was narrow, 480 yards of clear water between the confirmed position of contact Echo at the northern edge of the corridor and contact Delta at the southern edge. 480 yards for a ship 20 meters wide with 230-yard margins on each side. In daylight, in good conditions, at 15 knots, 480 yards was workable. At 3:24 a.m. in the western Hormuz approach, at 10 knots with 7 dark contacts in the field, and a Mohajer overhead 480 yards was workable only if the contact positions were confirmed and continuously updated by the Seahawk's airborne radar throughout the transit. CPA, corridor transit? If we take the corridor between Echo and Delta, CPA to Echo 230 yards, CPA to Delta 250 yards, both contacts drifting slowly westbound, corridor will shift 30 to 50 yards. Over the next 20 minutes, the corridor itself is moving. Seahawk can track and provide real-time updates during transit. The second friction arrived at 3:26 a.m. from the chain of command. Fifth Fleet's encrypted circuit delivered a message flagged priority. Fifth Fleet was tracking the Mohajer drone via satellite and had identified its ground control link as originating from a station on the Iranian coast near Bandar Abbas. Fifth Fleet requested the commanding officer's assessment of whether the 7-contact placement met the threshold for reporting as an unsafe navigational hazard under international maritime regulations, which would require notification to the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center and publication to all traffic in the approach. Publication to all traffic. A Navaria warning broadcast to all shipping in the Hormuz approach would inform every commercial vessel in the westbound lane of 7 dark contacts at positions that the destroyer had identified. It would alert the IRGCN that the destroyer had mapped the field, and it would create a radio record of the destroyer's transmission, which the Mohajer was equipped to receive and record on the public maritime communication channels that the IRGCN's media operation could access. The captain's response to Fifth Fleet was drafted in 30 seconds. 7 contacts assessed as IRGCN placement based on Mohajer overhead and coordinated AIS/light absence. Navigational hazard assessment, real but manageable with Seahawk airborne radar support. Public broadcast not recommended. Would inform IRGCN of field mapping status and contribute to their media framing. Proceeding to transit via Seahawk-supported corridor. Will report positions to Fifth Fleet for Maritime Authority notification after transit is complete. After, not during. The positions would be reported after the destroyer had passed through the field, when the navigational information was historical rather than real-time operational, and when the IRGCN's ability to respond to the position report was reduced. At 3:29 a.m., the CIWS entered passive thermal track mode on the Mohajer drone at 1,800 feet, not an engagement posture. A measurement, the CIWS's thermal sensor locking onto the drone's engine exhaust signature and confirming the drone's orbit parameters in the same way it had been used against surface contacts in previous encounters. The drone was being tracked by a system that had one function, and the drone's ground control station would be receiving telemetry from the drone's own EW sensors indicating that it was being tracked. The message it sent to the Mohajer's controllers: we know you are there. We know your orbit. We know your altitude. We know your ground control link direction. You are the one being observed as much as you are observing. At 3:31 a.m., the destroyer increased speed to 12 knots and began the corridor transit. Helmsman, course 265 degrees. Ready? The course had not changed. The heading that would take the ship through the 480-yard corridor between Echo and Delta was the same heading the ship had been on since entering the Strait's western approach. The corridor was aligned by the geometry of the 7 contacts placement, approximately on the existing westbound heading. The IRGCN had positioned the contacts to create a slalom, a corridor that required deviations to navigate, forcing visible course changes onto the drone's camera. But the corridor between Echo and Delta was wide enough and aligned closely enough with the existing heading that the transit required minimal adjustment. The Seahawk provided contact position updates every 60 seconds as the destroyer moved toward the corridor. Each update confirmed the contact's drift rates and adjusted the CPA estimates. The corridor was moving westward with the current at approximately 40 yards per minute. The gap itself drifting, the transit requiring continuous position management against a shifting reference rather than a static one. CPA Echo, 235 yards, stable. CPA Delta, 248 yards, stable. CPA Foxtrot, 890 yards, not a factor. CPA Golf, 710 yards, not a factor. The destroyer moved through the corridor at 12 knots. The helmsman made 4 course corrections during the transit. None more than 3 degrees. Each one returned to 265 degrees within 40 seconds. The Seahawk's updates arrived every 60 seconds, confirming that Echo and Delta were holding their drift vectors and that the corridor was maintaining its geometry within the predicted parameters. At 3:47 a.m., Echo passed down the starboard side at 228 yards, confirmed by the Seahawk's radar as the closest approach to any contact in the field. Delta was at 260 yards on the port side simultaneously. At 3:48 a.m., Golf, the southernmost contact, passed at 680 yards. The corridor transit was complete. All contacts astern, CPA to all contacts opening. We are through the field. The destroyer resumed 15 knots at 3:49 a.m. Course 265 degrees. The 7 contacts were behind them, continuing their slow drift westward in the lane, their positions known and confirmed, and now being transmitted to 5th Fleet for Maritime Authority notification and Navaria warning publication that would alert all subsequent traffic in the approach. The Mohajer had been overhead for the entire transit. At 1,800 feet altitude, in total darkness, its cameras had recorded the destroyer's approach to the field, the Seahawk launch, the corridor transit, and the passage through the 480-yard gap between 2 dark contacts at 3 a.m. The footage existed. It showed a U.S. destroyer transiting a field of dark contacts in the Hormuz approach at 3:47 a.m., passing through a 480-yard corridor between 2 vessels at 228 yards and 260 yards. It did not show a course deviation. It did not show a speed reduction to 0. It did not show a ship that had been stopped by 7 dark vessels in its lane. It showed a ship that had developed the sensor picture, identified the corridor, and driven through it at 12 knots in the dark. The helmsman completed his watch at 4 a.m. The standard rotation, 13 minutes after the corridor transit. 33 minutes from the CIC's first contact report to the cleared field. 33 minutes of 3 a.m. in the Strait of Hormuz, with 7 dark vessels in the lane and a drone overhead. He handed off the wheel to his relief and walked aft. He did not stop at any bulkhead. He did not stand anywhere and look at anything in particular. He was hungry. He went to the mess, found eggs on the warmer from the previous midnight meal cycle, ate them, standing at the counter in 3 minutes, put the tray down, and went to his rack. He was asleep in 6 minutes. The Strait of Hormuz continued past the porthole at 15 knots. One Mohajer-class surveillance drone, 7 IRGCN, dark contacts in the westbound approach. 33 minutes from first detection to clear field. 228 yards. Closest approach to any contact during corridor transit. 4 course corrections totaling less than 12 degrees cumulative deviation. 0 navigation lights visible on any IRGCN contact throughout. 0 AIS active on any IRGCN contact throughout. 0 course deviations captured on drone footage. Corridor identified by Seahawk airborne radar. Transit completed at 12 knots. The night belongs to the radar. At 3 a.m. in the Strait of Hormuz, the radar that matters is the one at 1,400 feet, looking down at 7 small boats that thought that darkness was on their side. Darkness is not a weapon when the other ship has a helicopter